But the Obama administration is hoarding economic talent. You know, the number of Ivy League PhDs floating around the Obama administration is high, beginning with Larry Summers, the head of the National Economic Council, Christy Romer, the head of the Council of Economic Advisors. These are smart people. Ben Bernanke wrote famous books on the Depression. So it'd be hard to argue that there's a lack of horsepower in the administration on the economy. So how can they be getting this wrong? Does it say that what to do with the financial sector is just an intractable problem? How else could you explain the lack of ability to articulate a clear plan that the markets buy?
Well, maybe these people aren't as smart as you think they are.
Well, all right, so don't go and don't buy a Harvard PhD. It's not worth as much as it was a few weeks ago. I don't know.
We're all victims of our training and our studies. Bernanke studied the Great Depression, which had its own sequence of problems, which is a liquidity problem, not a solvency problem, and a monetary management had a deflationary orientation because of the commitment to the gold standard. We're not in that world. We're in a world in which solvency is a fundamental problem, where we need to clear up the issues with regard to the bank balance sheets, get rid of more banks. We have to have the cleaning up that bankruptcy would represent. And Bernanke looks like he's solving a different problem. Paulson did not want to have nationalization of the banks. So the only thing he could think that we could do the only way we would cure this is the U.S. government would buy these troubled assets. But he didn't know how you could possibly organize the purchase of these troubled assets. So he floated this idea of a reverse auction.
Troubled Asset Relief Plan? Is that what TOP stands for? I don't know. We can ask audience members for that. Okay, so let's move on from, we've beaten the poor banks up here for a few minutes. Let's talk about the other thing that's very much on the minds of Australians, fiscal stimulus. How much, how to do it, where to direct it. Obama gets praised, I think, for acting quite decisively, that is, convincing Congress to give him the authority to spend $800 billion over 2 years on a stimulus plan, but he gets criticised a lot as well, as you know. He gets criticised by people on the left for saying there's not enough stimulus from the left, the Krugman side, and then the other side says, the Wall Street Journal side says, listen, all the US is doing is bankrupting itself in the future. So decisive Obama, but a stimulus plan that no one seems to like. What's your take on the stimulus plan? Does it help? Does it hurt? Is it irrelevant?
Well, I don't like it either, is the short answer. So the rhetoric in the United States is about the government creating jobs. But for a business, a job is a cost, not a benefit. And in a normal economy...
Do you want to explain that?
Yeah, I'm going to do that. In a normal economy, when the government attracts workers into public activities, it does so by removing them from the private sector. So there's no creation of GDP. It's a transfer of jobs from one sector to the other. You don't create jobs, you transfer from one to the other. That's a normal, healthy economy. When you have unemployed resources, as we do here in the United States, I guess maybe in Australia as well, then there is a possibility for a stimulus where if you focus the spending in the area where those resources are underemployed or unemployed, then you can bring them back to work and you can get a real creation of jobs. So if you're going to have a doctor and decide what kind of stimulus the economy needs, the doctor has to look to see exactly where the job losses are. In the United States, the job losses are in construction for homes, automobiles, because the Americans aren't buying automobiles. They used to buy 16 million units, they're only buying 9 million units. Restaurants, nobody's taking their family out to meals anymore. And there's a lot of entry-level jobs in restaurants, a lot of temporary work. A lot of people really need those jobs. And the other one is retail, same thing, a lot of relatively low-paid temporary jobs. People are not shopping. So if you're going to design a stimulus package, what it's got to do is create some spending in these critical 4 areas. If you look at that $800 billion that you made a reference to, only $8 billion of it is directly targeted on these 4 critical sectors. A little bit of help for housing, not nearly enough. A little tiny bit of help for automobiles, and nothing evident at all for retail or for restaurants.
So 1% of the bill is appropriate stimulus in
Well,
your view?
there's another aspect to it, too, that quite a bit, about $200 billion goes to the states in order to keep the states afloat. That is helpful because most states have balanced budget requirements, and the tax takes of most states in the United States are way down. And that means that spending is going to go down, too, in these states unless they have some help from the federal government. So that aspect I totally support. But the rest is things like infrastructure, education, and then tax cuts, none of which is appropriate to the illness that we have. Tax cuts are not going to be spent on homes, cars, restaurants, or retail. Most of that's going to be saved. Maybe a little bit leaks in these critical sectors, but not too much.
So infrastructure is a very important point. Kevin Rudd in Australia, Barack Obama in the US say infrastructure spending is a double win. We put people to work today and we create things for the future. You're not a big fan of infrastructure spending in this environment?
Well, you think about the people who worked in restaurants. Are they going to be building bridges and working in the crews on when they're constructing roads? I don't think so. They don't have the skills or the background. And the same thing is true with all these other activities. The framing work in housing, which is gone because they're not building homes, those skills are not suited to the kind of construction that infrastructure represents. So the U.S. has, for a decade, maybe more, neglected the future. And that neglect is evidence in the fact that we've had a deteriorating infrastructure, a deteriorating educational system. That most important investment for the future is our education of our kids. We've let our public school system deteriorate very significantly. That we have not been accumulating assets to back up liabilities for retirement. So there's no evidence on either the private scene or the public scene that there's any concern with regard to the future. So the focus that Obama has on infrastructure, education, and probably retirement, that's highly desirable. That's a festering problem, been ill-treated for a long period of time, but it's not a stimulus. It's not for helping the U.S. economy this month or next month. It's doing the things that need to be done. But the way that the accounting that you go for that is the traditional accounting, which the jobs are a cost, not a benefit. We want that infrastructure building because it creates more production, more GDP in the future, not because we're creating jobs through that activity. Maybe a little tiny bit, because the spending might trickle into a restaurant meal here and there. But we got an emergency. We got to get those workers back to work. And they're not going to find jobs as a consequence of the stimulus package anytime soon.
Okay, so Rahm Emanuel, Barack Obama's chief of staff, in a very rare, unguarded moment for a politician, said a few months ago that this is too good a crisis to waste. And I think Warren Buffett, to his shareholders yesterday or the day before in Berkshire Hathaway, said, in poker terms, Barack Obama's gone all in. So we've got not only $700 billion and counting on banks, not only $800 billion in the stimulus package, not only $75 to $200 billion in housing. Barack Obama also wants to expand this year healthcare coverage to the 50 million Americans who don't have healthcare. He wants to create, bless you, a climate change regime based on a carbon tax. And the headline numbers say that the US budget, so that the conservative estimate says the US budget deficit this year will be $1.75 trillion. Most people think it's going to end up being higher than that, which is what, already 12% of the US economy. It's going to be higher. That'll be the biggest budget deficit since World War II. On top of that, projections from the Brookings Institution, a paper by Alan Auerbach this week, says that unless the US increases its tax take by 7 to 9% of GDP or reduces spending by 7 to 9% of GDP, the US deficits are just going to be in the trillion plus range into the indefinite future. Mm-hmm. Is Barack Obama bankrupting the United States? And what should he be doing to couple needed short-term massive cash infusions with long-term fiscal responsibility in an environment where the healthcare system is broken, the retirement system is broken, education doesn't work, and roads have too many potholes? tough time to be the US president, I'm afraid.
Well, you have to be responsible. We have to raise taxes. The problem is the taxpayers have this idea that government spending is free if they don't pay taxes. They think that President Bush gave us a tax cut. He didn't give us a tax cut. You only get a tax cut if you have a spending cut. What he gave was a tax postponement, meaning that there's going to be more taxes later on. Most voters are totally oblivious to the tax postponement. So they're totally oblivious to the deficit concern that you raised. But Barack Obama is not. He was very clear in that speech that he gave last week that he felt it was a necessity to cut that deficit. It's unconscionable to pass all this load on to the next generation of taxpayers. We have a terribly low savings rate, and we're just not being good custodians of the assets of the United States, and it's time to get the taxes up. The problem is it's pretty hard to do that now in the context of a sluggish economy, but I think as soon as you start seeing economic growth in the United States, as soon as the private sector becomes healthy again, that's a time when we have to be fiscally responsible and start raising taxes, not to hopefully to slow the economy, but rather to reduce the burden on future taxpayers. And that deficit that you're talking about, I think that excludes the biggest time bomb of them all, which is Medicare. There's something like $50 or $60 trillion worth of
medical coverage by the government for retirees.
For the retirees. There's something like $60 trillion worth of unfunded liabilities. So a corporation that promises health care or retirements to its individuals in the United States is required to pull out of current earnings enough money to fund those future obligations. Our federal government doesn't do that. We have this accumulating liabilities for both Social Security, retirement, and for medical care for the retirees, and nobody is willing to do the hard decisions today, which is do the taxes that are necessary to fund those looming obligations. In fact, we had a so-called surplus, a technical surplus toward the ends of the Clinton years, but if you did the accounting the way that U.S. corporations do, to include those unfunded liabilities, we never had a surplus. Even in the very best years, we had a deficit. And it's a big looming problem, a huge problem that the U.S. government sooner or later, and the U.S. Economy sooner or later is going to have to come to grips with.
Okay, so that's analysis, and inevitably one ends up, when you get analytic here, you buy into some of the doom and gloom, the kind of gloom that leads Olivier Blanchard at the IMF to say that this is the worst economic crisis in 60 years, or leads Martin Wolf to say that a lost decade for the entire global economy is not out of the question. But I know you're an optimist, and I know you're optimistic about a recovery in the US. So do you want to try to explain why you're optimistic and give some, you're in the forecasting business, give us some point predictions for when the bottom comes in the US and what the recovery looks like?
Well, there's something that I think is very important. That's the U.S. economy has been growing at 3% per year for almost 40 years, since 1970. And not just 3% per year, but the deviation from that 3% has been pretty small. I had a chart that I showed earlier today. It's almost like a straight line. And these Martin Wolf story, the Olivier Blanchard story are saying suddenly the U.S. is going to be on a totally new trajectory. But we've been hit by all kinds of problems in that 40-year period of time. We had a huge increase in oil prices. We had the Reagan tax cuts. We had the peace dividend or not. We had a big cutback in the Department of Defense in the early 90s. You had the internet bubble in the late 1990s, the Bush tax cut. You name it. All the things that you think would have kicked the U.S. economy on a different growth trajectory, they don't show up in the data at all. So had we had this same talk at any one of those other episodes, like the oil price shock, we would have said, oh, this means the end of economic growth for the U.S. because there's no way that we could ever deal with that problem. But with all those things, we've still been growing at 3% per year. That growth comes from productivity growth. GDP growth is growth in productivity. That's output per hour, plus growth in hours worked. The hours worked is mostly demographic. And if anything, that's going to be a little stronger because Americans are going to be working a little longer hours and later in life in order to repair the damage that the financial markets have done. So the bet against the United States about this Martin Wolf and Olivia Blanchard story, that is saying that those productivity trends, underlying improvements in productivity that come from technological innovations and also from education, that's suddenly going to come to a halt. And I don't see anything in this financial crisis that suggests that the internet, the folding in the internet, and all the other innovations that are constantly occurring is going to change that underlying deep trend. It could happen, but there's no reason to connect the financial crisis with the change in the fundamental source of economic growth. And then secondly, I think that we have to recognize that the economy is not a mechanical system. So after 9/11, everybody saw those Twin Towers crashing down over and over. It was played over and over. And it really concerns you because you start to think of that as a metaphor for the economy. The economy is going to crash too, just like the mechanical system did. And everybody's worried that the 9/11 causes terrible economic malaise, terrible economic downturn that we would never recover from. I don't know. But in fact, the economy is an organic, self-healing system. So as soon as those functions that were served in the World Trade Center, as soon as that was destroyed, the system starts to heal itself. Those financial activities are being taken over by somewhere else. Right now, the U.S. economy is healing itself. Actions being taken by individuals all over the country are healing the economy. I'll give you an explicit example that there are investors now that are buying homes in California. When most people were sitting on the sidelines, people are starting to see attractive prices. That gives us support for home prices, and we think you're going to see the bottoming out of home prices and bottoming out of home construction in the middle part of this year. Then with regard to the last thing you're asking for, a forecast, the thing you need to understand is that technical forecasting comes from comparing where we are today with things that happened historically. Well, there are no comparisons really. In the U.S. historical data, there's nothing that's particularly pertinent because we haven't had a kind of stumbling forward and then falling down a cliff like we had in September and October and November. We've never seen these credit spreads, the spreads between the corporate bonds and the U.S. Treasuries. You've never seen 3-month Treasuries paying nothing. In fact, for short periods of time, it was negative. I mean, you had to pay Uncle Sam to hold your money. You put your money in Uncle Sam's bank, and you end up at the end of the year having even less. We haven't seen a kind of collapse in the housing market or in the auto sector like we saw in September, October, and November. On and on. It goes so then what you're really asking is, from a forecasting standpoint, is predict fear. We got gripped by the Great Depression fear in September, October, and November. Investors did what you would need to do if the Great Depression were actually coming again, which is sell equities at any price. But consumers did the same thing. Instead of spending every money of income, they decided to save some and put it in the mattress so they'd have a few dollars available for the Great Depression. This thing is going to lift when that fear dissipates. And it's very hard to know when it will, but the Obama rhetoric is definitely helpful, I think, because it gives you a sense that we have leadership that is, maybe only sense, is in command of the situation and is going to take action that will actually make it better. But if you just listen to his rhetoric and let those words pour over you, I think you can't help but feel a little bit more optimistic.
So that'd be a good place for us to move to questions from the floor. So I encourage people in the audience both to think about questions you'd like to ask Ed and begin making your way to either of the mics we have on either side. And while it's going on, I just wanted to ask a last question, which now is moving out from the US to the world. Australians and other people are really concerned about protectionism. They were very worried about Buy American provisions in the stimulus bill. Are you worried about the story of the Great Depression goes from Great Depression to protectionism to nationalism to war. Let's just take the first chunk of that, from a deep recession to real protectionism. Are you worried about that? Should we all be worried about that? Are leaders today much smarter than they were in the 1930s and they won't let us go down that slippery slope?
Well, the sequence in the 30s was first weakness in the economy and then that Hawley-Smoot tariff, and then the Great Depression. And most economists think that protectionism contributed greatly to the extreme nature of the Great Depression. I'll tell you a little fact about the United States, I think, which is pertinent to this question. Normally, exports are a source of strength when the U.S. economy is weak. Most other countries of the globe have their business cycle driven by external events, by exports. The U.S. business cycle...
by U.S. demand.
And by U.S. demand. The U.S. cycle has been driven almost exclusively by internal consumer spending on homes and cars. When homes and cars sales weaken, then the U.S. goes into a recession. When they start to improve, that's when you pull out. The fourth quarter was unique in a lot of ways, but one thing that is, I think, astounding and very worrisome is that when the U.S. gets that -6% economic growth, a full -4 is because of weakness in exports. So the U.S. economy is being held up by the global economy through most of 2007. And a large reason why we collapsed, or a significant reason why we collapsed in the fourth quarter, was consumer spending was so weak. But in addition, there was no place else to sell the products as the whole globe was suffering from this economic downturn. What that says is we're all in this together. We're all in this together. We have to have coordinated policy. We have to understand that global trade by its own nature is going to shrink a lot more than the economies around the globe do, than GDP does. But GDP is going to be a lot worse if we all adopt this protectionist sentiment and try to export our problems to other countries by protectionism. So I'm sure that most leaders in the globe will speak openly, forthrightly, strongly against protectionist sentiment, but still, in the U.S. Congress, there's plenty of noises with regard to what are we going to do about China in particular, but other issues of protectionism as well. Whenever things go bad, the natural instincts of many politicians is to point to the foreigners as a source of the problem, but really the U.S. problems are 99.99% right at home, and they ought to be cured right at home and not look to the Chinese or anyone else. And that's certainly true with Australia. The Australian exports to China are a critical part of the success that the Australian economy has had over the last half dozen years, and it's a source of concern going forward.
Great. Question right here on my right.
Hello. You just finished on the note of protectionism there. That's sort of part of what I wanted to say.
I hope it's the point of rather than part of.
Okay, you can
Sorry.
make the point of. On the one side, what we've actually, one view is that what we've had is a collapsing physical economy, and it appears that physical economy is something that's hasn't really been heard much in this whole debate. It's very much a monetarist-oriented view, which does make sense. And in fact, what's been left out of the monetarist side is, of course, the derivatives bubble. And there are estimates that there are a quadrillion plus worth of derivatives outstanding.
Wait a second, I'm getting a little confused now. I thought I knew what a trillion was. A quadrillion is above me, but it does remind me of an old aphorism, which is you can't turn a statement into a question by saying at the end, do you agree?
I'm not going to say that.
Okay.
A quadrillion is 1,000 trillion, by the way.
Okay.
So we have this growing debt bubble, and I agree that there is fear, but fear didn't create this debt bubble, this derivatives bubble. So we have this growing pile of monetary problems on the one hand, while on the other hand we've got a collapsing physical economy. And of course FDR did help get out of the Great Depression through massive infrastructure projects. This is of course the view of Lyndon LaRouche, who forecast this crisis and who's proposed the Homeowners and Banking Protection Act. And in Australia, the Citizens Electoral Council has also been forecasting this and has put forward solutions. I just wanted to ask you why there isn't more talk of infrastructure construction with the latest technology, which means nuclear and maglev, and why we're not talking about a bankruptcy reorganisation of bankrupt institutions, which is what the banks are. They're essentially bankrupt. Why don't we treat them like a normal bankrupt institution and take banking, the issue of credit, back to the state? I'm not saying that I agree with Ron Paul's view of everything he says about the Federal Reserve, but why don't we set up a Hamiltonian national bank again? So bankruptcy reorganisation, infrastructure construction, go back to national banking. This seems an obvious solution. As you said, the Ivy Leaguers don't know what to do. why aren't they talking about these things more often? James Galbraith testified to Congress just on Friday saying, almost what I've just said. So I'd just like to find out why these things have been omitted from the debate.
Well, it sounds like they haven't been omitted. I've heard these discussions often. Again, with regard to infrastructure of any type, my main point is that it should be done according to the traditional accounting rules where you count the jobs as a cost, not a benefit. Because this is not putting unemployed resources to work. And that means you got to go through item by item basis whether the taxpayers want to support this particular infrastructure project, counting the jobs as a cost, not a benefit. As far as the restructuring of the financial system, I'm totally in favor of more bankruptcies. I think we've got to seize on the recession as an opportunity to have some accountability and to do some serious restructuring in the financial sector. I don't think national banking is very appealing, but it's not something that I've done a lot of thinking about. But we're a long way from the end of the road as far as how the financial system is going to operate, particularly with regard to regulatory issues. I think that derivatives, the big elephant in the room are these credit default swaps. The reason that AIG is soaking up so much money from the taxpayers is because all the credit default swaps that are on their balance sheets. And that's a market that seems to me obvious. It's got to be transparent. We have to know who owns what, and it has to be under the control of our authorities. Otherwise, we're going to get in this mess again. So I totally am sympathetic to the idea that there has to be some substantial regulation, but we need to also understand that the markets are self-regulating, at least to some extent, in the sense that once you made a terrible mistake like was made this last couple of years, or actually the last half dozen years, it's not likely to be made again. You might make a new mistake, but there'll be a long time before the private markets would issue those subprime loans like they did in 2004 and 2005. You don't need regulation to prevent that from happening.